I stepped through the frosted glass doors of the Metropolitan Club with my heart hammering against my ribs, though my face showed nothing but calm. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the private dining room, and the sound of corporate small talk filled the air like white noise. But the moment I crossed the threshold, conversations stuttered to a halt. Eyes found me, dozens of them. My wife, Rebecca, stood near the bar with a martini frozen halfway to her lips, her smile dying on her face. Her colleagues from Apex Dynamics turned toward me, their expressions morphing from curiosity to confusion to something that looked almost like pity. And then I saw him, Richard Holloway, Rebecca's CEO, tall and sharp-suited, watching me with the kind of amusement reserved for insects that had wandered somewhere they didn't belong. He moved toward me with deliberate steps, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The room seemed to lean in, waiting. When he reached me, he looked me up and down slowly, letting his gaze drag across my modest suit, my nervous hands, my carefully neutral expression. Then he smiled, not warmly, but with the cold edge of someone used to being obeyed. "You weren't invited," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. I felt the heat of embarrassment try to crawl up my neck, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to meet his eyes. Around us, Rebecca's co-workers exchanged knowing glances, already crafting the story they'd tell on Monday morning about the pathetic spouse who crashed the company dinner. I could practically hear their thoughts. How embarrassing. Poor Rebecca. Who shows up uninvited like that? Rebecca herself looked stricken, her face pale except for two bright spots of color high on her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, trapped between defending me and saving face in front of her colleagues. I watched her choose the latter, her eyes dropping to her drink. That hurt more than Holloway's words. But I didn't turn around. I didn't apologize and slink away like they all expected. Instead, I let a small, knowing smile touch my lips. Just a hint of something that made Holloway's confident smirk falter for half a second. "Interesting," I said softly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. The room held its breath. Rebecca's boss, Marcus Chun, shifted uncomfortably near the appetizer table. Linda Hartwell, the CFO who'd always treated me like furniture at company events, stopped mid-sip of her wine. Even the servers seemed to pause, sensing that something was about to happen. I took my time, letting my gaze sweep across the room. I saw the smug certainty on their faces, the way they'd already written off this moment as an awkward interruption to their evening. They thought they knew how this story ended, with me, humiliated, backing out through those frosted glass doors. They were wrong. "You mentioned invitations," I said, turning back to Holloway, my voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. The murmur of conversation had died completely now. "That's an interesting topic." Holloway's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't think. Because according to the shareholder registry," I continued, speaking over him with a calmness that belied the racing of my pulse, "the person who actually owns 87% of Apex Dynamics doesn't need an invitation to anything. They own the room." The words landed like a bomb. Someone, I think it was Marcus, actually gasped. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room frozen, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Heads swiveled toward Holloway, whose face had gone from ruddy confidence to a sickly gray in the span of 3 seconds. Rebecca's martini glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor in a spray of glass and gin. Nobody moved to clean it up. "That's," Holloway started, but his voice came out strangled. He cleared his throat, tried again. "That's not possible, isn't it?" I asked mildly, reaching into my jacket pocket. I pulled out a folded document, one I'd been carrying like a talisman for the past 3 weeks, ever since my uncle's will had been read and the lawyers had explained exactly what I'd inherited. "Would you like to see the transfer documents? They were filed with the SEC last month. I'm surprised your legal team didn't mention it." The paper trembled slightly in my hand, but I didn't think anyone noticed. They were all too busy staring at Holloway, watching his mask of authority crack and crumble. Linda had gone pale, her wine glass hanging forgotten in her hand. Marcus had actually taken a step backward, as if distance might somehow protect him from whatever was about to happen. And Rebecca, God, Rebecca looked like she'd seen a ghost. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw the moment she understood. She knew about Uncle David's death, of course. She'd come to the funeral, stood beside me during the service, squeezed my hand when they lowered the casket. But she hadn't known about the shares. I hadn't told her because we hadn't been talking much lately. Because she'd been working late every night for the past 6 months. Because when I'd tried to discuss the inheritance, she'd brush me off with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before diving back into her laptop. Because our marriage had been dying for months, and I'd been too afraid to admit it. "David Thornton," I said, and my voice only shook a little. "My uncle. He founded Apex Dynamics 40 years ago, and when he died 3 months ago, he left his controlling stake to me. His nephew. The one person in the family who'd actually bothered to visit him in the hospital." I took a slow step forward, and the crowd parted like water. Nobody met my eyes now. They were all staring at their shoes, at the walls, at anything except the man they'd just watched their CEO try to humiliate. "So when you say I wasn't invited, Mr. Holloway," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, "I have to wonder, invited to what exactly? My own company's event? The dinner I'm technically paying for?" I paused, let the silence stretch. "Or did you mean I wasn't invited to watch my wife laugh at inside jokes with colleagues who pretend I don't exist?" Rebecca made a small, wounded sound. I forced myself not to look at her. Holloway had recovered some of his composure, though his face was still pale. "Mr. Thornton," he began, and I noticed the shift to my last name, the sudden veneer of respect painted over his earlier contempt. "I apologize for the confusion. Had you known, I interrupted gently, you would have treated me differently." "Yes, I understand that. That's rather the point, isn't it?" I moved past him, walking slowly between the round tables with their pristine white cloths and their artfully arranged centerpieces. People shifted nervously as I passed. I heard whispered conversations starting up, frantic and confused. "Did you know? How did we not know? What does this mean for the merger? For the quarterly reports? For us?" "Let me be clear," I said, stopping near the head table where name cards had been arranged with meticulous care. My name, notably, was not among them. I didn't come here to make a scene. I came because my wife invited me 3 weeks ago, before she apparently decided it would be easier if I just didn't exist for the evening. Rebecca's voice finally broke through the stunned silence. "Jake, that's not. I didn't mean. Didn't you?" I turned to face her fully now, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to take back the words and pretend everything was fine. But that part was tired. So tired. "When was the last time you introduced me to your colleagues as anything other than Rebecca's husband? When did you last mention what I do? My work? My interests?" She opened her mouth, closed it again. We both knew the answer. "For 3 years, I said quietly, I've been the invisible spouse. The plus one who doesn't quite fit. The embarrassment you manage rather than the partner you celebrate. I told myself it was fine, that you were focused on your career, that it would get better once you made senior director or VP, or whatever the next goal was." I looked around the room, at all these people who'd treated me like furniture, like an inconvenient accessory to Rebecca's professional life. But it wasn't going to get better, was it? Because none of you, including my wife, ever saw me as a person worth knowing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Linda looked like she might cry. Marcus had his hand over his mouth. Even the servers had retreated to the corners of the room, unwilling to interrupt whatever this was. Holloway cleared his throat. "Mr. Thornton, I think we should perhaps discuss this privately." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's uncomfortable? Because it's awkward? I've been uncomfortable and awkward at every single one of these events for 3 years, Mr. Holloway. I think the rest of you can handle one evening." I walked to the head of the table and pulled out the chair that had been reserved for Holloway. It was a power move, petty and deliberate, and I felt a surge of dark satisfaction as I sat down. The symbolism was unmistakable. I was claiming my place, not just at the table, but in the company, in the conversation, in the hierarchy. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge of steel I didn't know I possessed. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be meeting with the board of directors. We're going to discuss the future direction of Apex Dynamics, including several management changes that are long overdue." Holloway's face went from gray to white. "You can't." "I can," I said simply. 87% controlling stake. I can do quite a lot, actually. and I've spent the last 3 weeks reviewing company financials, strategy documents, and performance reports. You might be surprised what an uninvited guest can learn when people assume he's not paying attention. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. I'm not a cruel man, Mr. Holloway. I'm not going to fire everyone in this room out of spite, but I am going to implement some changes, starting with a culture assessment. Because any company where the CEO thinks it's acceptable to humiliate someone at the door, where an entire team watches it happen and does nothing, has a culture problem. Linda found her voice, though it came out shaky. Jake, Mr. Thornton, we didn't know. If we'd known who you were. That's the problem, isn't it? I said softly. You didn't know who I was, so you treated me like I didn't matter. But I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago. The only thing that changed is your perception of my power. I stood up, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache. I'd won, if you could call this winning, but I felt no triumph. Only a deep, bone-weary sadness. Rebecca, I said, and my wife finally met my eyes. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown for the next week. I think we need some space to figure out what we want, whether there's anything left to save. Her face crumpled. Jake, please, I know, I said, and meant it. She hadn't meant to hurt me. She'd just been so focused on climbing the ladder that she'd forgotten to look down and see who she was stepping on. But intentions don't erase impact, and I can't keep being invisible just to make your professional life easier. I walked toward the door, my steps echoing in the profound silence. As I reached the threshold, I turned back one last time. Enjoy your dinner, I said. I'll see most of you in the boardroom tomorrow at 9. And then I walked out through those frosted glass doors, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and shattered assumptions. Behind me, I heard someone start to cry, Rebecca, probably, and the low murmur of shocked conversation beginning to build. I didn't look back. In the end, power isn't about who can shout the loudest or who has the fanciest title. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to be diminished. For 3 years, I'd made myself small to fit into Rebecca's world. But that night, walking out of the Metropolitan Club with my head held high, I finally understood I didn't need to fit into anyone else's story. It was time to write my own.